Welcome back, everyone. So now that we've covered some of the more common components inside of a system, let's start taking a look at some of the slightly more advanced topics that we will encounter. Particularly, we're going to talk about job queues and servers. You can kind of break this job queue down into a general queue as well, because that's what we're going to cover. So diving into this, what specifically is a job server and a job queue? So we'll talk about the connection between the job queue and the server a little later. But for now, let's break this term down. What is a job? So jobs are pretty interesting in the sense that they are a very core component of large distributed systems. Here, we're going to understand what a job is in the context of a job server because we've already learned about web servers. So the work here is pretty similar. With web servers, we know that we handle business logic. Now, what is business logic? Well, if we break down business logic is pretty much when the web server has to compute some kind of behavior that the browser client is asking for. In order for us to do this computation, usually we interface with a database, which we've learned about so far. This is where, depending on the context and depending on the developer, the definition of business logic can get a little hazy. Everyone's kind of got a slightly different definition, but one of the most common definitions for business logic is that it is the code that delivers a functionality specific to the business. So when we talk about the business here, we're talking about the actual browser client, so the user. Any kind of logic that drives some type of outcome based on the user's expectations or the user's data or the user's interaction with the actual application, that is all business logic. So any code you write that has to eventually interface directly with the user or as a result of the user, that is business logic. Now, everything else is what we can call application logic. So application logic is still very similar. You're still writing code. It's still driven by the code that you write. It looks very similar to business logic, but the context is not necessarily around the user anymore. So this is just one style of the definition between business logic and application logic. And let's take a look with an example here. So looking at our job servers, let's go back to our Facebook example. Remember when we were looking at our newsfeed? We know that with the newsfeed, we have these posts. But where do we store these posts? In fact, where do we get them from? So I mentioned that we store our post data inside of the database, and then we query for it and we modify it. But how do we make sure that our database has all of the up-to-date posts that a user might query for? So we might get these posts from news outlets, from magazine outlets, or websites particularly, or even blogs. So you can imagine how on Facebook has in its feed a lot of these articles or headlines coming from these external sources, right? These data sources. Here, in order for us to get these up-to-date articles into our database from these data sources, we need some step to do that. This is where the job server can step in and perform that activity. Remember, these sources must be coming into our database at some point throughout the day in order for us to actually provide this to the end user. So here inside of our job servers, we have written application logic or code that will then query these data sources in order to fetch the appropriate news outlets or the appropriate new articles, etc. So you can imagine our job server queries the news and then gets it back, stores in the database, does the same for the magazine, does the same for the blogs. This is pretty much a job. So you can think about a job as a unit of work. It's just some computational work that we need to do in order for our application to actually have the appropriate functionality or the appropriate data that it needs to perform what it needs to do for users. Remember, the user might be able to request from the actual web servers what it needs for it to interact. But as far as making sure we have all of the appropriate data, everything else that might exist inside of our application that is not user-driven, then that is application logic. So here you might be wondering, though, this job equals a unit of work. Unit is a pretty abstract term, what represents a unit? Is a unit of work where we simply query one of our data sources and then update it in the database? Or is it where we query all of our data sources and then update it inside of the database? This is where it gets a little bit more context driven. It really depends on the amount of work it takes for this to be done. It depends on how much time it takes for this to be done. It depends on whether or not in the process of doing this where things might break. This is where it really depends on the actual context itself. So you essentially need to see jobs in terms of the unit of work as being abstract for this reason. Much of system design is very contextual. It is not just a one-size-fits-all solution for everything. In this particular case, the reason why I wanted to bring up that both of these scenarios could be considered a job is because they can be. It really just depends on the size of the work. And this is where your expertise and your experience, having worked as a senior, is going to benefit you in being able to decide and explain what a job in this case is going to be, because that's what the server is going to do. Now, the reason why I'm hyper-focused on this job being one unit of work is because where we need to now go is to understand, how does this job server know it's time to start running these jobs? This is where we're going to talk about a job queue. And we'll take a deeper look into this idea of a job being a unit of work as well. So the main thing, again, that I want you to remember about these job servers is that there are a lot of these different servers, and there's all this code that actually makes it so that your system does the things it needs to do when it's time for the user-driven code, which is our web servers and our business logic, to actually perform its function. And again, an easy way to think about that with a newsfeed. A user might ask for their specific newsfeed posts, but in order for your application to have the latest posts that all your users might be able to query, that has to be work that is done in the background, independent of the user's interaction. And that you can easily put in the application logic or inside of your job servers. So now that we understand job servers, let's talk about the job queue. I'll see you in the next video.